Good morning and welcome to our midweek reflection for Wednesday, the 7th of October. And this morning we're doing our morning Bible readings from the lectionary from Acts chapter 23, beginning at verse 12. The plot to kill Paul. The next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed Paul. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "To His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Thanks be to God for his word. Well, poor old Paul, as we've been going through Acts, we realise just what a time of it poor old Paul had. He was hated everywhere he went. People opposed him and stirred up trouble. There were riots, with people stirred up in riots everywhere he went. He was often put in prison. There was false accusations, floggings and beatings, trouble and hardship everywhere. And now we read that over 40 people are out for blood. And they've actually, can you imagine this? That they've actually taken a vow not to eat or drink, and no, not to eat anyway, to fast until they kill Paul. I mean, they must be so desperate for him to be out of the way. He must pose such a huge threat to them. But thanks to the bravery of his young nephew, their plan gets thwarted. The young nephew goes and tells Paul of the plot against him. And Paul quickly thinks and calls the centurion in and asks the centurion to take his nephew to see the commander. And so the young nephew, having to be brave again, goes with the centurion to the commander, and he tells the commander what he's heard about the plot to kill Paul the next day. Fortunately for Paul, the commander listens to the young boy, and he decides to sneak Paul out at night under a heavy guard and take him to Caesarea before these men can carry out their plot. And so Paul is now taken off in the middle of the night, well, at 9 o'clock it says, to Caesarea, where he stands trial before Governor Felix. And Felix can't decide what to do with Paul, so he just puts him in prison for a while. In fact, Paul's actually in prison there for 2 years while Felix is deciding what to do with him. And after a couple of years, though, Felix is then succeeded by Festus, and so now Festus is the governor, and Paul gets to make his defense once again. He's made his defense in front of Felix. Felix doesn't know what to do, and now he's making his defense again in front of Governor Festus. And it's interesting because he preaches to Festus, and Festus often asks him back again on occasions to tell him a bit more. So there's obviously an interest being sparked there. But Felix is also a bit weak, and he doesn't want to make any decisions about Paul on his own. So he decides again to wait. I'm going on in the next few chapters here, but it's important that we see what this is all about. Felix wants to wait for King Agrippa to come so that King Agrippa can make the decisions about Paul. And so then Paul again will get to tell his story to King Agrippa and preach the gospel and the good news to him. And thinking about all of that, I guess we could, if it were us, if we were in Paul's shoes, we could see all these difficulties and problems as blockages to our ministry, couldn't we? And I'm sure I do quite often when something goes wrong. I think, a question. What have I done now? What have I done wrong? Or why is this happening to me? And it feels like it's a barrier to the gospel. It feels like it's something trying to stop the gospel from being preached, and something trying to prevent the Christian ministry from going forward in whatever way that might be. And so we can see trials and difficulties as opposition and as barriers to the gospel. Or we could see it as an opportunity or as opportunities, because maybe this is an opportunity for Paul to preach the gospel in places that he wouldn't normally get to go. I mean, there's no stopping Paul from preaching the gospel, is there? He preaches wherever he goes. He never stops telling the gospel. And he preaches to the Gentiles mainly, but he goes into the synagogues, he goes into the streets, and he preaches to anyone who will listen. But because of this plot against him, he's being taken at night to Caesarea, and from there on, we see him having the opportunity to preach the gospel to people in high places of power. And he wouldn't normally have got that opportunity. So you could see this as the enemy working against you, these barriers and these oppositions and these things that go wrong, or we could see them as actually God opening doors to take us into different areas, different places that we wouldn't have gone to before. And I guess that's a bit like what's happened with this virus in one sense, that it's meant that I'm doing things like this because the church actually had to close. So in order to reach people, I've had to get to know and learn how to use social media and do stuff online. And so rather than seeing it as a barrier to the good news being preached, maybe we could see it as an opportunity to preach the gospel in different places to different people and to get the message out there. Because that's certainly what happened here for Paul. Now, Paul was faithfully preaching the gospel. And because he was faithfully preaching the gospel, it meant that some people got very, very angry with him and wanted to kill him. I mean, that's a bit extreme, isn't it? To go to that length to actually want Paul dead and actually fasting in order to make a vow not to eat until he is dead. I mean, I don't know when they stopped or whether they started eating again because they didn't achieve their goal. But actually, we have to go back to a little verse in the previous chapter and back to chapter 18 in our Bibles to see where Paul gets his courage and his stamina from, really. In chapter 18, we read that Paul has a vision from God, and God appears to him and speaks to him in this vision. And God tells him, he says this, he says, don't remain silent. Just keep on speaking, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you. So Paul knows that he's called by God to keep speaking the gospel, and that's what he does. He doesn't ever stop. God has called him in whatever circumstance he finds himself in to keep preaching the gospel. And Paul knows that God is with him and that God is protecting him and watching over him. And he's made him this promise, even though he does get beaten up and put in prison and stoned on one occasion. God has made him this promise that no one is going to attack and harm him. So he's had that promise. And then just a verse or two before, in verse 11 of chapter 23, we read this, that the following night, this is before this plot is arranged, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. So God has drawn close to Paul and told him that he's going to have to preach the gospel in Rome and to take courage. So in other words, he's saying, be bold, don't fear, but you're now going to preach the gospel in Rome. So Paul knows that this is not just the enemy working against him, but that God is able to use anything, any circumstance, even a plot of the enemy for his good, in order to get Paul where he wants him to be. And so Paul keeps speaking despite the opposition, and the plot to kill him fails. And the fact is that God uses this plot to get Paul where he wants him to be. So it's a challenge to us that when difficulties come, when problems arise, and we see almost like this is a barrier to the gospel, or this is preventing us from fulfilling our mission or fulfilling our ministry, maybe it's not that as much as we think it is. And maybe we need to learn to see the open doors and the opportunities that these things provide, that maybe God is steering us in a different direction. Maybe we've been doing what we're called to do in one particular way for a long time, and God's maybe saying, I want you to just steer a little bit round into a different direction, because I need you to speak now to these people. And without that plot, or without being imprisoned and put on trial, Paul would never have got to speak to these governors and King Agrippa. So he would never have got to be in these places of power where powerful people who make decisions that affect our lives live. And Paul's ministry seems to be that he's been given open doors to do just that. So perhaps we can see that today for ourselves, whatever we're going through. Maybe it's not a barrier, maybe it's an open door to a new way of preaching the gospel, or to a new way of doing mission or ministry. So let's be alert. Let's keep our ears open to listen for God's voice, because God did warn Paul. God did tell him that he had to preach the gospel in Rome now. And I'm sure that he thought, I don't know how that's going to happen at some stage, but and then this young nephew. I wonder what had happened if the young nephew had kept silent. It might have been the end of Paul, mightn't it? If he'd kept silent, Paul may have fallen into that trap. We don't know, unless, if he'd have kept silent, maybe God would have revealed that plot in some other way, or used something else to save Paul and get him where he wanted him to be. But we praise God that the young man did go and warn Paul. And maybe that's something for some of us today too, that when we see things that are not right, or when we hear and see things going on that we know are not right, it's about finding the courage to speak up against those things rather than just keeping quiet. Some thoughts for today. Enjoy the passage, enjoy reading on in Acts, and seeing all that I've been talking about and Paul's opportunities there to preach the gospel. Have a good day. God bless, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now. Bye.